When the German Wehrmacht unconditionally surrendered on May 8, 1945, around 18 million people had worn its uniform. But it wasn't just German citizens. There were also non-German soldiers from over 40 countries serving in varying numbers and for different reasons. Of course, there was a big difference in the size of the individual contingents. For example, since 1941, there was a commando unit in the Abwehr department, two at the high command of the Wehrmacht, the so-called Special Unit of the Brandenburg Training Regiment. In the Regenwurm camp, named after the little river Regenwurm near Meseritz in Silesia, there was a small company where sons of noble Persian families served. However, this group was unknown in Germany, and they were only interested in Hitler's victory to the extent that they feared Iran would come under Soviet rule. After these young men had received German officer training, the Regiment Brandenburg, stationed at the Generalfeldzeugmeister Kaserne in Brandenburg and der Havel, had taken action. That they were not senselessly sacrificed at some random point on the front, but were released in their homeland. And in contrast, there was the contingent of around 1 million Soviet citizens, from individual volunteers, known as Hiwis, to the so-called Russian Liberation Army under the Soviet General Vlasov, with a strength of up to 130,000 men. With this vast number of fundamentally different men who had either volunteered or, out of hunger and fear of dying in the POW camps, had put on the German uniform, the overwhelming majority stayed with their units until the end of the war. However, there were also a number of mutinies, which I made this video about. Mutinies in the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS during the Second World War. The most serious one took place in 1945 on the island of Texel, carried out by the Georgian Infantry Battalion 822, which had been integrated into the Wehrmacht, during the night of the 5th to the 6th. In April 1945, they literally slaughtered their German cadre personnel. By sunrise, up to 400 Germans were said to have been murdered in their sleep. The video about it is titled 1945, The Bloody Mutiny of the Georgian Infantry Battalion 822. On Texel. Among the foreigners from all over the world who served in German uniform, there were, of course, people of all religions. For example, in 1942, first in Frankenberg, Saxony, then at the Königsbruck military training area near Dresden, a legion formed from British Indian prisoners of war, numbering between 3,500 and 5,000 men free India, that is, Indian Infantry Regiment 950, under Major Erich Krabbe, from 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Krabbe. The Free India Legion, or Azad Hind, was initiated by Subhash Chandra Bose, who died in a plane crash in August 1945. There is this video about Azad Hind. Azad Hind, the Indian Legion in the German Wehrmacht, the Forgotten Army. In contrast to the British Army, which separated religions in its Indian units, in the Free India Legion, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Jats, Rajputs, Marathas, and Garhwalis served side by side, with 1/3 being Hindus and about 2/3 being Muslims. In total, around 70,000 Mohammedans Muslims, or Muslims as they are called today, fought on the German side in World War II. However, this contrasts with the number of 2.5 million Muslims, mainly from Pakistan, North Africa, and India, who were mobilized during the war by Great Britain and France. Among them, 2 million were Indians in the British Army alone. The previously mentioned Brandenburg Special Unit, was also involved since the end of July 1941 with its 11th Company as the formation unit of the Syrian Arab Special Unit 288 under the command of Colonel Otto Menton, who has been missing since April 18, 1945. The stationing location was Cap Sunion in Greece, known for the ruins of the ancient marble temple of the sea god Poseidon. On August 19, 1941, the 1st Battalion consisted of 30 officers and officials, 54 German non-commissioned officers and enlisted men, and 28 Arab non-commissioned officers and enlisted men, including French foreign legionnaires, who had been taken prisoner. The Special Unit 288, along with other units, was designated, among other things, to operate under the overall command of General. The pilot Helmut Felmy was to capture oil fields, to spark revolutionary movements in Syria and Iraq, and to support the establishment of a greater Arab empire. Hitler had planned for 1942 to seize the Caucasus with a strong army group and to enter Syria with a second one from Greece, to raise the flag of rebellion in the Arab world there, and to unite with the Caucasus army at the Iranian-Turkish border. This was also intended to put pressure on Turkey and force it to enter the war on the side of the Axis powers. But it remained neutral until the symbolic declaration of war against Germany and Japan on the 23rd February 1945, and did not participate militarily against these two countries. In addition to Special Unit 288, which was transferred to Africa in early January 1942, renamed to Panzer Grenadier Regiment Africa in October 1942, and had captured the Kasserine Pass in February 1943. Also stationed in Greece was the German Arab Training Detachment Special Unit 207, whose Arab personnel had also previously been trained at the Regenwurm camp near Meseritz and at the General Ordnance Master Barracks in Brandenburg an der Havel. Two of the leaders of the Arab movement, Rajid Ali al-Gailan and Fawzi al-Kabuchi, who served as Iraqi Minister of War from 1947, were often guests in Brandenburg. Fawzi was described by the Germans as an educated and chivalrous Lebanese, deeply rooted in the teachings of the Quran, and proud of his descent from the great Algerian freedom hero Haji Abd el-Kader. He was also mentioned by the highly successful German writer Karl May in 3 of his works: The Love of the Ulan, From Baghdad to Istanbul, and In the Realm of the Silver Lion, Part 1. And when May undertook an 18-month journey to the Orient at the turn of the century, on the 10th June 1900 he visited Abd el-Kader's tomb in Damascus and wrote in his travel diary, "I also love this Muslim, who in his nobility saved so many Christians, even though it was Christians who brought him all that suffering." May was referring to Abd el-Kader's intervention in 1860 during the civil war in Lebanon, the Lebanon Mountains, during the massacre of Christians, which according to Winston Churchill claimed about 11,000 victims, and in which 308 Christian villages and 560 churches were destroyed. Another one who was behind the Free Arabia Legion, which was the collective term for the Arab units in the Wehrmacht, was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Mohammed Amin el-Husseini, who had been living in exile in Berlin since 1941. Very polite, always smiling, and basically completely non-committal, he traveled through Europe, pulling strings for his pan-Arab cause. With his support, the East Turkic SS armed formation was established in 1944 as the first East Muslim SS regiment, with the intention of expanding it into the Muslim SS division Neu Turkestan and then into a corps. However, that never happened. The commander was SS Standartenführer, equivalent to Colonel Wilhelm Hintersatz from Senftenberg in Lower Lusatia, now known as Wilhelm Harun el-Rashid Hintersatz Bey, who had already converted to Islam in 1918 while serving in the German Asia Corps in Turkey. Militarily, there wasn't much that could be accomplished with the catastrophically armed 1st East Muslim SS Regiment, which was only equipped with 150 horse-drawn wagons. Instead, it stood out more because of the number of desertions, which reached into the hundreds. When Wilhelm Harun el-Rashid Bey, who was highly decorated in both World Wars, on the 29th, when he passed away in Lübeck on March 29, 1963, 4 Federal Border Guard officers stood vigil at his coffin. As for the other Muslim units, due to time constraints and for the sake of clarity, I can only address a few of them. Because these were too diverse, often changed their names, were dissolved and re-established, or were incorporated into other units. There were indeed many of them. It is probably more interesting to explore the question of why the German political leadership, as well as the military, were so eager to establish Muslim units in the army and the Waffen-SS. The recruitment had begun, or rather, the recruitment of Muslim volunteers for the Eastern Legion in the Wehrmacht in the territories they had conquered had already begun shortly before the formation of the Eastern troops. Here's the explanation. Eastern legions were composed exclusively of members of the non-Russian minority peoples of the Soviet Union, while Eastern troops were formed from Soviet prisoners of war and volunteers from the German-occupied territories of the Soviet Union, such as the 1st Cossack Division under Lieutenant General Helmut von Panwitz, who was from Upper Silesia. After the surrender, he and his division were handed over to the Soviet Union by the British at Lienz in Austria, and on the 16th January 1947 he was executed in Moscow along with 11 other Cossacks, atamans, and generals. For this, see the video, 1945, The Tragedy of the Cossacks, handed over at Lienz in Tyrol. Now, after the period from October 2nd, 1941 to the 7th, from January 1942, after the Germans lost the Battle of Moscow, the war situation noticeably worsened, and partisan activity in the rear combat area increased. At the end of 1941, the commanders of the German armies had, more or less on their own initiative, decided to search the prisoner of war camps in their areas for volunteers, known as Hiwis, to relieve the frontline troops, and in fact, for various reasons, a large number of Soviet defectors, prisoners of war, and volunteers from the local population had come forward, who were now being used as guards, ammunition carriers, translators, drivers, cooks, and auxiliary personnel, and, starting in the winter of 1941 to 1942, also as active fighters side by side with German soldiers. Among the first of these auxiliary troops was also the 1st Muslim Unit, a Caucasian battalion that was formed in October 1941 under Reserve First Lieutenant Theodor Oberländer. The so-called Sonderverband Bergmann consisted of Georgian, Armenian, Azerbaijani, and other Caucasian prisoners of war, and was part of the Caucasian Mohammedan Legion. It was planned to drop sabotage groups behind Soviet lines by parachute. For example, in the failed Operation Shamil, for which there is this video, and also this book, where you can find everything about this doomed mission. From September 1942, the fluent Russian-speaking cavalry general Ernst Kustring was appointed as the representative for Caucasus Affairs at Army Group A. In June 1943, he became inspector of the German-commanded Turkic formations, with a strength of 102,000. 102,195 men. However, the Armenians, Azerbaijanis, Georgians, and North Caucasians were often poorly armed and trained, and were not a significant military reinforcement, especially when they were deployed far from their homeland, like at the Atlantic Wall in France. Here, in 1944, parts of a Georgian battalion had refused an order to attack, and in another battalion, some had deserted during the Battle of Normandy. And on Texel, as we heard, the Georgian Infantry Battalion 822 murdered its German cadre shortly before the end of the war. In total, around 30,000 Georgians served in the ranks of the Wehrmacht. In addition, there were also the so-called Eastern Legions, such as the Caucasian Mohammedan Legion, consisting of Azerbaijani, Circassian, Dagestani, Chechen, Ingush, and Lezgin volunteers. There was also the Waffen Group Turkestan, from which the 162nd was formed in 1943. Turkmen Infantry Division was formed, under the command, as of the 25th, Major General Oskar von Niedermeyer, who died in Soviet captivity on September 25, 1948, commanded 16 battalions with a total strength of about 16,000 men. The total number of soldiers who served in the Turkestan Legion is estimated to be between 110,000 and 180,000. Then there was, for example, the Caucasian Waffen-SS unit, under SS Standartenführer Arvid Teuermann, and, of course, the 13th, which is always highlighted when it comes to the Wehrmacht and Muslims. Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Handschar, 1st Croatian, under its commanders from July 2nd to 9th, August 1943, who on the 26th, January 1945, in Nagel, West Prussia, deceased Austrian-born SS Standartenführer Herbert von Obwurzer from the 9th, Zeitrieth, August 1943 to June 1944, who on the 20th, October 1946, in Neuengamme camp, died by suicide in British captivity, SS Brigade Führer and Major General of the Waffen, SS Carl Gustav Zauberzweig, and from June 1944 to the 8th, May 1945, the Austrian-born SS Standartenführer, SS Brigade Führer, and Major General of the Waffen SS Desiderius Hempel. Finally, the 23rd, which, however, only existed from June 10 to September 24, 1944. Waffen Mountain Division of the SS Croatian No. 2 under SS Standartenführer Helmut Reitel, and for a few days until its dissolution, SS Oberführer Gustav Lombard. However, one should not assume that the de facto official recognition of Islam in Germany was an invention of the National Socialists. The German Empire, founded in 1871, already pursued a favorable political course toward the Mohammedans, who in turn often saw a natural ally in Germany against their English and French colonialists. Thus, German Emperor Wilhelm II expressed during his visit to Syrian Damascus on November 8, 1898, Tatuchantisians, may the Sultan and the 300 million Mohammedans scattered across the earth be assured that at all times the German Emperor will be their friend. And shortly thereafter, he wrote in his private notes, "For years I have warned against trampling on and provoking Islamism in such a way, and I was ridiculed all over Europe and mocked as a Turkish fool. They all were meant, English and Russian politicians, in their insane stupidity, stubbornness, and incredible arrogance, despite all my warnings, have despised, mistreated, insulted, and trampled on Islam for years. Then, whether he wants to or not, the Sultan must unfurl the Prophet's green flag. Then Allah's name will resound in every corner of Asia and Africa, and that will be the end for the Christians." In any case, an important representative of Islam, the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey, was a reliable force of madness in World War I until the very end. Because while the Italian ally had already left the alliance in May 1915 after promises from the British and French, and had declared war on both Austria-Hungary and, in August 1916, on Germany. By the way, just like in World War II in October 1943, the Ottoman ally was a loyal comrade in arms of the German and Austro-Hungarian forces. German Asia Corps, which is what this video is about, 1916 to 1918, German Asia Corps, Yildirim, German and Turkish soldiers against England and France. However, for staying on the German side, the Ottoman Empire on the 10th. August 1920, in the dictated Treaty of Sèvres, a suburb of Paris, had to suffer heavily. Because while the Treaty of Versailles, directed against Germany, was softened in its intended harshness by France mainly through British influence, the Treaty of Sèvres, particularly due to the influence of Great Britain, fundamentally called into question the existence of an independent Turkish state. For those who would like to study this topic in more detail, I recommend looking into Arthur Balfour, who served as British Foreign Minister in 1917 and who, on November 2, 1917, in the declaration named after him, he made a sort of promise for, quote, a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. With this promise, Great Britain, in the war against the Central Powers, as shown in orange, the military term for the alliance of the German Empire and Austria-Hungary with the Ottoman Empire and the Kingdom of Bulgaria, secured the support of Zionist organizations around the world. At the same time, however, they also made false promises to the Arabs, as can be vividly seen in the epic film Lawrence of Arabia. The Balfour Declaration was also issued by the British because, in June 1917, news reached London about German negotiations with representatives of Zionism and the Ottoman Empire. With the declaration, Great Britain hoped both to disrupt these negotiations and, at the same time, to win over the largest Jewish populations in the USA and Russia. But above all, London was thinking about bringing Palestine under its own rule after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, which created a perfect connection for them to the British spheres of influence in the Middle East and the most important British colony, British India, and of course, with the improved protection of the Suez Canal controlled by Great Britain that came with it. This dishonest behavior of the British and French in dealing with the Arabs during and after the First World War was also one reason why Germany succeeded in recruiting Muslims to serve in the Wehrmacht. While Hitler was skeptical about recruiting East Slavic Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, during a meeting on the 12th December 1942 at the Wolf's Lair headquarters, he stated, I consider only the Muslims to be reliable. I consider all others to be unreliable. And the Chief of the Army General Staff, Colonel General Franz Halder, emphasized that the recruitment of Muslims was not only to strengthen the combat power of the German units, and of course, not only because of the propaganda effect on enemy troops and civilians, but also because of the political and religious attitudes of the Turkic peoples and their good soldierly qualities. This view was also shared by the already mentioned commander of the 162nd, which was established in May 1943. Turkmen Infantry Division, Major General Ritter von Niedermeyer, who, based on his experience, believed that Christian Armenians and Georgians needed to be monitored more carefully than, for example, the actual Muslim Turks. And the Chief of the High Command of the Wehrmacht, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, reaffirmed in the summer of 1943, during a conversation about recruiting volunteers from the Soviet Union, Hitler's positive assessment of the Turkic volunteers, whom he saw as, quote, the most bitter enemies of Bolshevism. In the end, Muslims made up the largest religious group among the non-Russian Wehrmacht soldiers from the Soviet Union. When the Wehrmacht had to surrender unconditionally in May 1945, all soldiers of the so-called Eastern peoples who were taken prisoner were handed over to the Soviet Union by the Americans and British. Here, General Shuko is handed over to the Red Army in Judenburg, after which they were immediately executed or sentenced to many years of forced labor in the gulags. But it should also not be concealed that, in particular, the Eastern legions deployed in the Waffen-SS, as well as Eastern troops, were involved in countless war crimes, often also against their own population. And they cannot be compared in any way, for example, with Waffen-SS units from the Benelux countries or Scandinavia.